good.
All right. So I want to talk today about enhancing biodiversity in the U.S. Corn Belt to improve environmental quality and sustain crop production. And the work I'm going to talk about is the result of long-term collaborations with a lot of people here at Iowa State University, other universities, and a variety of other civil society organizations and U.S. government agencies. So I'm sort of the front person for these projects. And I want to call attention to the large amount of work that's been done by other faculty, other professionals, a large number of graduate students and postdocs. So here we are in the Corn Belt, which is the most biologically productive place on Earth during our peak growing season. So this is a satellite image of the photosynthetic fluorescence, light energy emitted during photosynthesis that can be observed from space. And this intensity of photon emissions from the Corn Belt is greater than any other place on Earth at its peak. So it outproduces the Amazon. We have a remarkable combination of fertile soils, favorable climate, high quality genetics, a highly informed set of farmers that make that productivity come together. But another factor that's taken place is we've concentrated almost all of our landscape on the production of just 2 summer annual crops. So this is a map of Wright County, Iowa in 2020, produced by the Cropland Data Layer National Ag Statistics Service Unit. And what you see here is corn fields shown in yellow, soybean fields shown in green, a little bit of riparian vegetation along the creeks, a couple of towns, a couple of ponds, but the overwhelming majority of this nearly 600 square mile area is dominated by just 2 summer annual crops, corn and soy. In Iowa as a whole, roughly 63% of our total land area and 82% of our cropland is occupied by just these 2 summer annual crops. This heavy concentration on 2 crops and the elimination of almost all non-crop vegetation throughout the heavily agricultural counties in Iowa and the Corn Belt is related to a number of emerging and continuing challenges that include soil erosion, water quality degradation due to the discharge of nutrients and pesticides, greater frequency and greater severity of flooding, a emerging set of herbicide-resistant weed populations, new crop diseases, quite a bit of economic volatility and the loss of wildlife habitat and reductions of wildlife populations, including monarch butterflies, bees, and other pollinators. Back in 2016, I was very fortunate to go to the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences and work with a European group that built what I think is the largest meta-analysis of the effects of cropping system diversification ever conducted. It's actually a second-order meta-analysis which took the results from other primary data meta-analyses and combined them into an overall assessment that included a comparison of almost 42,000 systems of diverse and non-diverse production, and also looked at the provision of ecosystem services that include things like pollination, pest control, the regulation of water flow, nutrient cycling, soil fertility, carbon sequestration, and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And what we found out was that in 63% of the 42,000 comparisons, you could increase crop yield while also gaining some of these ecosystem services. about 75% of the time there was a increase in yield, and the overwhelming effect of cropping system diversification was to improve the provision of ecosystem services. But we identified 63% of these cases where we could both increase yield and get an improvement in environmental quality or some other ecosystem service. So this suggests that cropping system diversification, which is the sort of opposite end of the spectrum of what we've done in Iowa, has a lot of potential benefits. Not in every case, but there's a lot we can learn. And what I'd like to talk about today is some examples here in Iowa of where cropping system diversification can provide these kind of win-win scenarios. So I'll talk about two examples. One is a long-term field experiment that involves a comparison of different crop rotation systems with and without livestock integrated into the system. And a second set of studies relates to the use of native perennial prairie vegetation placed in and around crop fields. And we'll talk about the data from these experiments, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we might make a shift, what kind of levers exist within our agricultural community toward moving to these more diverse systems. And then finally, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about what plant breeders might do and provide an example of where contributions could be made by the plant breeding community towards these more diverse and hopefully more sustainable systems. So the first study I'll talk about is conducted at an ISU research farm in Boone County. It was given by the Marsden family, and that name has been retained. It's about one section south and one section west of the Maine Agronomy Farm headquarters. And the study I'll talk about involves diversifying corn and soybean systems with oat and alfalfa, and recycling nutrients back onto the forage ground preceding corn production by placing livestock manure generated by animals that would be fed these kind of concentrate and forage materials. So I'll talk about a subset of the treatments present in that experiment today. As I mentioned before, a conventionally managed corn soybean system in comparison with a corn soybean oat alfalfa system. And that more diverse system, as I mentioned before, receives manure periodically. And I should say that the amount of manure that it receives is congruent with how much manure would be generated by the number of animals that could be fed the feedstuffs generated by the plots. So we're not artificially subsidizing the fertility of the longer rotation system with imported manure. We're using manure in a manner that would be congruent with recycling it on an integrated crop livestock farm. So these plots are each 60 by 275 feet. And when the experiment was established and throughout its lifetime, all phases of each rotation system are present every year. So that avoids confounding particular crops with particular weather conditions in particular years. We started in 2001 and 2002 with some baseline sampling of soils and weeds. 2003 through 2005 was a startup period when we went through each rotation system at least once. And then since 2006, what I'll call the mature period, we've had the rotations running smoothly. The work has been funded by the Leopold Center, the Iowa Soybean Association, and multiple grants from the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Institute for Food and Agriculture. So here's just a very brief summary of the management practices for these different rotation systems. As I mentioned before, we apply manure once every 4 years preceding corn in the 4-year rotation, but we don't use manure in the 2-year system. We apply 100 pounds of synthetic nitrogen per acre at the time of planting corn in the 2-year system. And then we add additional nitrogen based on soil testing If those soil tests come back showing that we need to increase the amount of nitrogen for corn yield, we side dress it. In the 4-year system, we don't apply any synthetic nitrogen fertilizer at planting, but we test the soil and we retain the option to add synthetic nitrogen as a side dress if the soil test results indicate that would be beneficial for yield. And then with regard to herbicides, for the set of treatments I'll talk about today, we broadcast herbicides, both pre-emergence and post-emergence in the corn and soybean phases of the rotations, but we don't use herbicides in the oat and alfalfa phases of the rotation. So by knocking out herbicides in 2 years out of 4, we've immediately reduced the use of herbicides 50%. We've also done some experimental work, which I won't report on today, where we've reduced the use of herbicides in the 4-year rotation up to 97% lower than in the 2-year system that is broadcast sprayed. You can see that over the period of time from 2008 through 2019, that 12-year period, we've used 85% less nitrogen fertilizer in the 4-year system than the 2-year system. There's small amounts showing up because we apply phosphorus in the form of monoammonium or diammonium phosphate when we tip up the phosphorus in the 4-year system. All right, so what does this reduction in nitrogen fertilizer and herbicides mean with regard to yields? Well, over the period of 2008 through 2019, there was a statistically significant 5% increase in the yield of corn and a 21% increase in the yield of soybean in the 4-year rotation relative to the 2-year rotation. Our oat yields were running on average 94 bushels an acre with a 35-pound test weight, which is higher than the Boone County average. And our alfalfa yields are running right on the state average of 4.2 tons per acre. So we're not giving up anything with regard to corn and soybean yield, and we're holding our own with oats and alfalfa in the longer rotation system. One of the reasons we're seeing increases in yield is that we're influencing the microbial life in the soil. So here's a example with Fusarium virgiliforme, which causes a disease in soybean called sudden death syndrome. And this fungus, which lives in the soil, infects the root of soybean. It damages the root, but it also transmits a toxin that moves from the roots into the shoots, and you get this loss of photosynthetic area. And under the cool, wet conditions that this disease is favored by, you can get fairly severe losses of soybean yield. So in 2010, I started working with the plant pathology group led by Leonor Leandro, and we have had a long-term monitoring effort to look at the incidence and severity of this disease. Incidence is the number of plants that are affected, and you can see there's a massive reduction between the 2-year and the 4-year system. And severity is of the plants that are affected by the disease, how bad is the disease? And you can see that the severity is also lower in the longer rotation. That's linked to a change in yield, and there's a highly significant increase in yield as the severity and incidence of SDS go down. The plant pathology group has included analyses of the amount of DNA associated with this pathogen, Fusarium virgiliforme, in the soil. So this is the amount of DNA material associated with the pathogen on a log scale in corn, shown in the triangles, open in the 2-year rotation, closed in the 4-year rotation, and in soybean, shown here. And you can see that in both the corn crop preceding soybean and in the soybean crop itself, there's a massive reduction in the amount of DNA associated with the pathogen in the soil. And we don't know the mechanism of that yet, but it appears to be related to the presence of the oat crop. So we're interested in whether there are exudates from oat roots and oat shoots. And we're also interested in what the microbial community is composed of in these longer and shorter rotation systems. That work is ongoing. All right, I've worked with Ann Johans, who builds the Ag Decision Maker sheets for Iowa Cooperative Extension and Outreach. She's an economist. Basically, she does what your accountant might do. You give her all of your expenses, what we spent on seed, chemicals, field operations, how much labor it took to do what we did. And then looking at the marketing year averages for Iowa, she calculates the gross returns from all the crops on a dollar per acre basis. And that's averaged across 4 crops for the 4-year rotation and 2 crops for the 2-year rotation. She calculates the costs of production, and then she calculates the net returns to land and management. And what you can see is that the gross returns from the corn and soybean system over this 12-year period were higher, but the costs of production were lower for the 4-year system than the 2-year system. So basically, it's a wash. Numerically, we come out a little bit ahead, but in terms of the statistics, there's enough variation that there's no difference in the profitability, including the costs of labor and all the inputs when we do these calculations over the 12-year period. All right, so what are some of the other effects that we've seen? Rebecca Baldwin-Kordick, a graduate student, looked at some of the soil-related effects and found that the diversification of this cropping system from soybean and corn to include oats and alfalfa resulted in a 26% reduction in soil resistance to penetration to a depth of 45 centimeters. That's a little bit more than 2 feet. And that means that a corn root that would grow into this ground would have an easier time penetrating the soil in the 4-year system than in the 2-year system. A couple of graduate students, one working with Michelle Wander, a faculty member at the University of Illinois, and another graduate student working with Kirsten Hofmackel, now with the Department of Energy, looked at some other aspects of soil. And particulate organic matter is what's called the labile fraction of soil organic matter. It's typically a small amount of the total amount of organic matter, but it has a very important role for holding soil particles together into nice crumb structure. It increases the porosity of soil. It increases the tilth of soil. It decreases the bulk density. And particulate organic matter is also very important for nutrient cycling. That organic matter breaks down frequently, turns over, and releases nitrogen, phosphorus, and other important plant nutrients. And you can see that there's a substantial increase in the amount of particulate organic matter carbon in the 4-year rotation relative to the 2-year rotation. Similarly, there's a large increase in the amount of microbial biomass in the soil. And this is an indication not just of an important form of organic matter in the soil, the living organic matter, but it also is an indication of the activity of soil life. And that may be important in the regulation of pathogens. It may be very important for the regulation of nutrient turnover and provision of nutrients to crops. Earthworms are more abundant. This is again Rebecca Baldwin-Kordick's work. She looked at the number of earthworms per unit of soil volume and found 71% more earthworms in the 4-year system than in the 2-year system. And former graduate student Megan O'Rourke, who's now a national program leader for the USDA NIFA program, when she was here at Iowa State, looked at the diversity of ground beetles. And she also looked at what's called the activity density, which is a combination of how many beetles are on the soil moving around and how frequently they're being trapped. So you can see there's a 46% increase in the activity density of these beetles and 34% increase in the species richness. These beetles are very important as predators of insect pests, and they're also very important as consumers of weed seeds, W-E-E-D. So they're more abundant, they're moving around more, and their species richness, which many agricultural ecologists use as an indicator of overall agro-ecosystem diversity, is 34% higher in the more diverse system. The last part of this system that I'll talk about is related to work I've done with two agricultural engineers at the University of Minnesota, Jason Hill and Natalie Hunt. And they do life cycle assessment using a variety of models. One that is called GREET, which is greenhouse gases, regulated emissions, and energy use in transportation, but it's not restricted to transportation systems. It's also useful for crops. Another one called USTOX, which looks at the human and ecotoxicological impacts of chemicals released into the environment. The soil and water assessment tool, which is a way of looking at soil and nutrient movement with water. And then INMAP, which is a way of looking at the impact of air pollutants on human health. So with regard to fossil energy consumption, what we saw was a 64% reduction in the use of fossil energy in the 4-year system relative to the 2-year system. When we looked at the amount of energy harvested in all of the crop products, corn grain, soybean grain, oat straw, and alfalfa hay, there was absolutely no difference in the amount of energy being produced on the plots. And then when you calculate the energy gain ratio, which is the amount of energy in the harvested crop materials relative to the use of fossil energy to produce those materials, you can see a 275% increase in the energy gain ratio in the more diverse system. So clearly there's a big impact on fossil energy use through diversification. When we looked at various forms of pollution, we also saw big improvements in the 4-year system relative to the less diverse 2-year system. So by spraying only half the crops, we got a 50% reduction in the herbicide aquatic ecotoxicity. The SWOT model showed a 44% reduction in the amount of soil loss to erosion. The SWOT model showed a 38% reduction in nitrogen discharge in runoff water and a 29% reduction in the amount of phosphorus discharged in runoff. And finally, a GREET model showed a 64% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's not just carbon dioxide, but it's nitrous oxide and methane as well. So an important set of indicators with regard to environmental quality showed this diversification of the 2-year system to the 4-year system had important effects. Finally, we looked at the emissions of fine particulate matter, so-called PM 2.5. These are very important pollutants that affect human health. They're known worldwide as having a large impact on human health. And if you look at the number of mortality events that would be caused by PM 2.5 and you multiply that by what's called a value of a statistical life, which is what the US Environmental Protection Agency uses when it does cost-benefit analyses of various practices. What we come up with is that there's a 57% reduction in the amount of damage per hectare or per unit of cropped area in the 4-year system relative to the 2-year system. So in terms of the impact on human health, diversification is directly beneficial through the reduction in emissions of fine particulate matter through the direct effects of farming, but also the emissions of ammonia, various sulfur and other nitrogen compounds and volatile organic carbon compounds. Ammonia in particular serves to create a lot of fine particulate matter when it's redeposited downwind of farming operations. So with regard to a summary, we can say that increasing cropping system diversity in this experiment, it included not just crops, but the reintegration of crop and livestock production can help meet productivity, profitability, environmental quality, and human health goals. And if you want to read about this, there are now about 33, I think at last count, scientific articles that have come out of this experiment. All right, shifting gears, I want to talk about cropland diversification with strips of prairie vegetation, watershed scale experiments and on-farm trials. This is one of our farmer cooperators in Wright County. You can see a strip of prairie vegetation sown in between this cropland area. Why are we focusing on prairie? Well, prairie has the ability to provide near year-round cover, which is very important in protecting soil. It has deep roots, which add some carbon and also hold the soil in place. It has stiff, erect stems during the growing season, which impedes the movement of water and sediment downslope and increases infiltration. It's a diverse community, which provides habitat for many other organisms, including these monarch butterflies. And it's native, so it's a way of enhancing in the small areas we have left in Iowa of our native biodiversity. This project we call STRIPS because it represents science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips. It started at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Center, National Wildlife Refuge, east of Des Moines in the mid-2000s. It's grown to a large group of scientists, educators, farmers, extension specialists, and cooperating farmers. This is a picture of our 10th anniversary celebration at the Neil Smith Prairie Learning Center, and it represents a cross-section of the people involved in this project. So the first part of this project started, as I mentioned before, in the mid-2000s. We got going heavily in 2007 and 2008 with research and demonstration on small experimental watersheds at this wildlife refuge. The experimental treatments involved 12 catchments. They ran 6 to 11% slope, and they were 0.5 to 3.2 hectares. That's roughly 1 to 8 acres. And we had a number of different treatments. So we had 100% no-till corn and soybean production. These egg shapes represent the watersheds. The top is the upslope. The bottom of the egg is the outflow at the bottom of the catchment. And then you can see we had different amounts of prairie at different positions within these catchments. And we looked at how diversifying these catchments with prairie vegetation affected a whole variety of performance indicators over multiple years. All the cropland in this experiment was managed without tillage. And once the experiment was sown, there was no soil disturbance. All right, so what we found very briefly was that sowing 10% of one of these watersheds with prairie vegetation reduced runoff, measured at the bottom of these watersheds by 37%, reduced the nitrogen in runoff 70%, reduced the amount of nitrate in the subsurface drainage water by 72%, reduced the amount of phosphorus in surface runoff 77%, reduced the amount of soil sediment moving out of the bottom of the watersheds by 95%. And then on the positive side, tripled the abundance of pollinator insects, doubled the abundance of birds, had no effect on yield per cropped acre, although of course, if you take 10% of the area out of production, you reduce overall production by 10%. And putting in these prairie strips was cheaper than terraces with a cost comparable to cover crops. So big benefits with small changes in terms of land use. This is what we call a disproportionate effect. A 10% change in land use on a per area basis had a more than 10% change in many of these performance indicators. All right, phase 2 of this project was taking the results and seeing what would happen on the farms of cooperators scattered around Iowa and now in a total of 13 different states. So phase 2 was testing this practice, seeing how it performed on commercial farms. And you can see one of these farms here in Tama County, where the prairie strips are sown in between the cropped acres on a hill slope. Concomitant with this effort to make measurements of how various performance indicators were doing on these commercial farms, we also did and are doing a lot of outreach work with cooperating farmers. This is a former agronomy graduate student leading a field day at a cooperating farm in Northwest Iowa in O'Brien County. And you can see a storm moving in and the audience is in rapt attention as she's talking about the diversity in these prairie strips, and some of the other cooperating researchers were talking about the biodiversity effects that can be found in these strips and in the adjacent cropland. Farmers are increasingly aware and accepting of prairie strips. So my colleague, Jay Arbuckle, in the Department of Sociology, leads the Iowa Farm and Rural Life Poll every year and gets responses from about 1,000 farmers. And over the course of the STRIPS project, he's been tracking the awareness of farmers of this prairie strips practice and also asking them, would they be interested in perhaps having prairie strips planted on their own farms? So you can see that about 65% of the farmers that he's polled in the last year indicate that, yes, they have heard of prairie strips. So this corresponds to about 650 out of 1,000 farmers. And roughly 20% of the farmers answered that they would be interested in discussing putting prairie strips on their farm. So that's what I think very favorable response to what started out as an experiment, but is now involving kind of active investigation, demonstration, fine-tuning, and fiddling on farms of cooperating participants. So because we're now a official USDA cost share practice, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, USDA is actually tracking the number of acres of prairie strips being planted throughout the country now. So this is through the last Farm Bill, a conservation reserve program funded practice. And USDA now indicates that 921 acres of prairie strips have been planted to protect a total of almost 113,000 acres of cropland in 13 states. So this is translational research in the sense that it started out as a whim at the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge, where we made some measurements that quickly, in a relative sense, got picked up and is now being adopted by farmer cooperators to see how this practice performs on their own farms. All right, So I want to finish up by talking a little bit about paths to changes in land use and shifts in farming practices. How do we do the kinds of things necessary to gain the environmental quality benefits, the ecosystem services, the enhancement of yield that might be available through these cropping system diversity practices? And in my mind, there are four important mechanisms. One is government policy, one is market pull, another is farmer-to-farmer information exchange, and the fourth is technical innovation and assistance. And I want to give you some examples of the relevance of these levers to what I've just talked about in the preceding hour. So as you're probably well aware, the United States government uses your taxpayer dollars to pay farmers for a variety of things: commodity subsidies, crop insurance subsidies, conservation programs, disaster payments, and a few other things. Iowa is the #2 state in the country, behind Texas, in terms of the amount of government money directed towards farmers. And you can see that over the last period of 1995 to 2019, a fairly long period of years, Iowa averaged $1.3 billion a year. That's about roughly $10 million per year per county for government payments. And we get a lot of money. Most of it's headed for commodity subsidies over that period, and now more towards insurance, but we're still getting quite a bit of money for conservation programs. And this represents a huge lever if it's directed for the kinds of conservation outcomes that we're interested in. So we're interested as taxpayers and as policy people, how this total amount of money is allocated among these different categories. And I would suggest that more of the money could be allocated towards conservation programs in a manner that protects farm revenue while better protecting water quality, soil quality, and biodiversity. As I mentioned before, in the last Farm Bill, prairie strips were included under the Conservation Reserve Program, and you can look this up, but it is a means by which farmers can get paid for implementing prairie strips on their land, and they can collect essentially a rent payment for this conservation practice. And when crop prices are low, this may be an attractive option. It may also be an attractive option on hillsides that have been quite eroded and don't have the yield potential that other areas of farm fields do, and also at perhaps the bottom of slopes that may be flooded in wet years with some frequency. They may not pay well. And this may be another location that prairie strips may be well suited for. All right, the food value chain in the United States involves $1.4 trillion paid by consumers at restaurants and in grocery stores and other businesses for food and beverage products. About 2/3 of that $1.4 trillion accrues to food processors, distributors, and retailers at the interface between farmers and consumers. And these folks are paying increasing attention to what consumers are asking for. And there's a project right now run by a group called the Sustainable Food Lab and Practical Farmers of Iowa, with funding from the USDA, the Iowa Department of Agriculture, the McKnight Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, and all these corporate partners, which include Cargill, ADM, Dannon, Grain Millers, Albert Lee Seed, McDonald's, General Mills, quite a few large and some smaller food corporations that are trying to make diverse rotations that include small grains work with regard to market pull. The idea being that if a significant number of grain buying firms can create a market opportunity for farmers, it may be profitable for those farmers to diversify their rotations in a manner that enhances environmental quality, but also protects the profitability of the farm. So this is one example of where market pull might be a mechanism where we can begin to diversify our agricultural landscape. Farmer-to-farmer information exchange is critically important as farmers take on new crop production opportunities. The ability to learn from other farmers is really important. It is a mechanism whereby farmers can gain more confidence that they can do something different than what they've been doing successfully and make it work profitably. All right, so finally, I want to direct a little bit of attention towards what plant breeders might do. And again, this goes back to the Iowa Farm and Rural Life poll that J. Arbuckle conducts. And in 2017, he asked farmers about what are the potential barriers to the integration of small grains into rotations in Iowa. And interestingly enough, 51% of the farmers identified the lack of small grain varieties with elite genetics for yield and pest and disease resistance as the most important factor preventing them from adopting small grains. So when I see, elite genetics and small grain varieties, I think plant breeding. And I want to give you an example of how this could work. So this is a farmer that I've known for a long time. I've done some cooperative work on his farm. He's in north central Iowa, and he's one of a group of farmers participating with some crop genetics firms from Europe and marketing firms in the US that have been looking at the performance of hybrid winter rye. And he has a situation where he needs to diversify his rotation for a variety of reasons I'll talk about in just a minute. And hybrid rye looked like it might be a good fit. So farmers in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa are trialing a number of varieties of hybrid rye on their farms and looking at the performance characteristics and other things that affect the performance of their whole farming systems. So Practical Farmers of Iowa, in concert with some of the outlying ISU research farms, have been trialing rye and looking at how it performs. This is a trial that was conducted at Kanawha in north central Iowa in 2019 and 2020. What you can see is these varieties circled in red are the hybrid European rye varieties, and they're yielding much higher than the kind of named open pollinated varieties that are normally available to farmers in the US. So this was done through conventional plant breeding, but it's developed varieties which not only have much higher yield potential, but also have much lower ergot infestation. So ergot is a toxin produced by the fungus Claviceps purpurea, which is bad for pigs and other livestock when they ingest it in feed. And the incidence of this ergot fungus toxin goes way down because of the floral characteristics of these hybrid rye varieties. So that makes it a much safer feed for inclusion in swine diets. And this farmer, who is a swine producer, has shown that when he introduces hybrid rye into the rations of his pigs, he can displace up to 50% of the corn and still get the rates of gain for pork production that he does with a corn-based diet. So it has a use value to this farmer in his livestock operation. And it allows him to diversify his rotation while still maintaining a profitable livestock component on his farm. All right, the other aspect of this diversification scheme with hybrid rye is related to giant ragweed. So this is a survey that was done of certified crop advisors across the central Corn Belt, actually from Pennsylvania across to Nebraska and the Dakotas. And what you see here is that this weed, giant ragweed, is identified as among the most difficult, or one of the most difficult weeds in increasing number of counties. And that's in part due to the fact it has stacked resistances to the more common corn and soybean herbicides, but also because it has a phenology that makes it extremely competitive, and its growth characteristics mean that it's extremely competitive with corn and soybean. So here you can see a field that was planted in hybrid rye next to a strip where the rye wasn't planted, and the same weed pressure from giant ragweed exists here in the rye patch with the area that wasn't planted. And you can see that hybrid rye is exceptionally effective in suppressing the growth of that weed, which makes managing that weed within the rotation much simpler. During the rye phase, the weed really never gets going because it's outcompeted by the rye, which is planted in the fall and has a vigorous head start in the spring when the giant ragweed is just starting to grow. From a weed management point of view, for both conventional and organic farmers, this hybrid winter rye looks like it has a lot of potential. So rye is one of the opportunities. There are many others with regard to crops that we could introduce to diversify rotations. And I think plant breeding has a lot to do with the success of how we can make diversified systems come to pass in Iowa. So with that, I'll stop, and I'll thank you for the opportunity to meet with you today, and I'll try to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.